The man who had last seen Brett Morrison alive reported that he had turned back once before disappearing into the darkness. For a moment, in that brief look, something had shifted in his eyes. Not fear so much, but an inner yielding. As if, on some level, he had already known he wasn't returning. If you're obsessed with tales in which the truth is in plain sight, in which each question leads to a series of more questions, ensure you're subscribed. For this case will push everything you believe you know about small-town secrets and the shadows they conceal. October in Alberta carries a specific type of cold, the type residents can feel in their bones before the first frost ever lays down. It's not the crisp, cold cut of January. It is softer, denser, wet cold that creeps through denim and fleece and nestles in your lungs like a threat. In 2003, that cold came early to the little town of Drumheller, population just under 5,000. It's a place carved into the Badlands, where ancient dinosaur fossils lie buried beneath rust-colored earth, and the Red Deer River cuts through the land like an old scar that never healed. The landscape doesn't comfort you. It watches you. The hoodoos, those tall, wind-carved rock pillars, stand mute witnesses to things folks would rather not remember. Brett Morrison was just 18 years old when he entered the Canadian border that September, shouldering a frayed blue duffel bag and an acceptance letter to a tiny university just beyond Drumheller. Head spent his childhood in Portland, Oregon, where the rain never really ceased and the trees stood so thick they swallowed sound. Out here, the broad prairie seemed alien, exposed, as if there wasn't room to hide. His mother, Carol, had feared sending him so far away. Another nation, another environment. But Brett had persevered. He was determined to learn forestry management, and the university's small program had one unusual benefit: actual, on-the-ground experience in the North Country's boreal forests. He was the type of person who was quiet, the sort who listened intently, thought hard, and didn't often raise his voice. With his dark blonde hair hanging over his forehead and a tendency to bite his lower lip as he thought, he fit easily into the background. His roommate, Owen MacLeod, a third-generation Albertan with a thick accent and easy grin, went so far as to comment later that Brett appeared to be homesick during the first month. But he refused stubbornly to admit it. The university itself was small, fewer than 800 students. 2 squat dorm buildings, 5 main halls constructed of brown brick in the 1970s, their narrow windows fighting the constant prairie wind. The hallways reeked of instant noodles and cheap aftershave. Brett's room faced a small parking lot and, past that, a field that blazed gold in late afternoon light. Owen remembered discovering him there sometimes, standing silently at the window, gazing out into nothing. Then initiation night. Each October, senior engineering students brought back an old, unofficial tradition, a welcome to freshmen that the administration hypocritically acted like it didn't know about. Officially, hazing was prohibited following a near-lethal episode in the late 90s. Unofficially, however, the ritual endured, talked about in cafeterias, hyped as a rite of passage. Owen had gone through it himself 2 years earlier. "It's harmless," he'd told Brett. "Just a bit of night hiking, some stupid challenges. You'll be fine." But this year felt different. The student in charge, Travis Bauer, 21, was known for pushing limits, and even the seniors were uneasy. On the evening of October 17, 2003, Brett got a phone call. The dorm's landline rang just after 9. Owen was at the library, so Brett was alone when he picked up. The call lasted less than half a minute. When Owen returned around 9:30, Brett was lacing up his boots, pale and silent under the glow of his desk lamp. "Where are you going?" Owen asked. "To the old grain elevator," Brett whispered. "The one beyond the East Road." Owen stopped dead. "The elevator? That's initiation stuff?" Brett just nodded. Owen described his roommate as appearing frightened, but also determined, as though Head already made up his mind about something. Brett put on his worn jean jacket, picked up his keys, and departed without further comment. That was the last anyone ever saw of him. The grain elevator was deserted for over a decade, a tall concrete shell standing above the prairie like a tombstone. It was 4 kilometers from campus, along a gravel road that had gone unmaintained for years. Local children used to challenge one another to enter it, but the doors were chained years ago. No lights, no homes, nothing but wind and silence. Brett Morrison strolled alone into that void, and he never returned. The following morning, October 18th, 7:43 a.m., the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were called on a missing persons report by Owen McLeod. He informed them Brett's bed remained made, unslept in. Initially, Constable Derek Santoro didn't give it much thought. College kids go missing overnight all the time. Parties, poor decisions, hangovers. But when Owen said the grain elevator, Santoro paused. Everyone in Drumheller knew where that was. And everyone knew nothing good ever went on there after nightfall. By 9 a.m., 2 cruisers from the RCMP were parked in front of the elevator, their lights flashing against a pale morning mist that curled around the ground like a living creature. The chains on the doors remained rusted, remained unbroken. The officers walked around the building, the gravel and shattered glass crunching beneath their boots, shouting Brett's name into the still air. The prairie wind responded hollow, chilly, with the scent of dust and concrete alone. No footprint, no fabric, no indication someone had ever been there. Constable Santoro was at the foot of the enormous building and felt something he couldn't define, a knowledge that whatever occurred here, it hadn't ended well. By midday, the search had expanded. 2 German shepherds were brought in from Calgary, handlers striding rapidly over the fields as volunteers, students, teachers, townsmen, dispersed in a rough line across the scrub. The dogs picked up a scent to the southeast, down a long ravine that carved through the prairie like an incision. Radios spat out sounds as teams broke off in all directions, the cold seeping through their gloves. Everyone knew there was little time left. On the prairies, a single misstep, one poor night, one ill-fated step, can be the difference between rescue and recovery. And as the hours ticked by, one terrible realization took hold among the searchers. Brett Morrison hadn't simply disappeared. Something or someone had ensured that he wouldn't be found. Carol and James Morrison arrived at the Edmonton airport around 2 in the afternoon, spent and hollow-eyed. They had taken the first flight out of Portland after they received the RCMP's call at 6 a.m. Oregon time. Carol could hardly speak over her tears. James, normally unflappable, a construction foreman who didn't cry often, just held her as the plane entered Canada, his jaw locked, his hands shaking though he tried to remain calm. They did not rest. From Edmonton, they went directly to Drumheller. 2 hours of hard driving across a landscape that reminded them more of the face of another planet than of the country their son had moved to call home. The yellow expanses of eroded hills stretched endlessly, and nothing was like Oregon's soft green forests. When they at last arrived at the little RCMP detachment on Drumheller's Main Street, Sergeant Linda Pereira stood waiting in the doorway. Her face was one Carol would never forget. A measured blend of sympathy and restraint, the face of someone who's done it way too many times already and already dreads the conclusion. Pereira took them to the search area, where dozens of volunteers made their way through the underbrush in wide, systematic patterns, their voices calling out Brett's name into the breeze. Carol held a photograph of her son, taken at his high school graduation just 2 months before, and flashed it before anyone who would look at her, as if the picture itself might bring him back. James stood a few feet off, quiet. His eyes raked across the endless prairie, scanning for any hint of movement. It was impossible. How could a man simply disappear into this endless, open space? The land ran on forever, interrupted only by groves of golden poplars and the deep gashes of dry ravines. Beautiful, yes, but brutally unfeeling. Then, from within the crowd, Owen McLeod came forward. His face was crimson and raw from weeping. He appeared frightened. He explained all to the Morrisons, the strange phone call, the departure of Brett for the abandoned grain elevator, how Head attempted to dissuade him. He apologized repeatedly, remorseful that he hadn't gone with him, that he hadn't prevented him. Carol hugged him, this stranger who was the final link to the world for her son, and he dissolved totally, crying out in guilt that wasn't truly his to wear, but would accompany him nonetheless. That little detail, the phone call, struck Sergeant Pereira. She leaned Owen away gently. Her questions were soft but sharp. Who had called? What did Brett say? Owen had no idea. He hadn't been there. But he recalled that Brett seemed nervous, perhaps even afraid, and that had spoken specifically about the grain elevator. Pereira made a note in her pocket-sized leather notebook. Something wasn't right. If this was initiation, why had Brett walked in alone? Why that building? And why was everyone being so silent all of a sudden? By late afternoon, the RCMP had begun taking in students for interrogation, starting with the senior-year engineering students who had organized earlier initiation nights. The first was Travis Bauer, a lanky, broad-shouldered 21-year-old with a careless arrogance that vanished the moment he sat in the interview room's unforgiving fluorescent glow. "Yes, we did discuss initiation," he admitted, his voice measuringly steady. "But we called it off this year. Too risky. The university's been cracking down." He said Head spent the previous night at his off-campus apartment with his girlfriend, studying. Pereira didn't believe it, but she had nothing concrete to refute him. The other students all reported the same thing, vague, coached, and eerily uniform. No one claimed to have called Brett. No one claimed to have been around the grain elevator. It was like a wall had been erected overnight, and on the other side of it, everybody had concurred to the same fabrication. As the sun set that night, October 18th, the prairie was blood-red and violet. The search parties came back to base spent and quiet. Brett had been missing for nearly a full 24 hours now. The temperature was plummeting rapidly, predicted to reach -5 by morning. At the command post, a folding table strewn with maps and radios, Sergeant Pereira gazed out into the black horizon. Somewhere out there, a young man was lost, hurt, or already dead. And she knew in her gut, somebody wasn't telling us everything. The following morning, October 19th, the actual interviewing commenced. Within the tight RCMP detachment, an area that reeked of stale coffee and stress, Pereira set about his task. She had a 15-year-old investigative technique. She wasn't an officer who yelled. Instead, she waited. Patient, calm, allowing silence to become so long that the young and fearful would attempt to break it, and, in doing so, get caught. When Travis Bauer returned for round 2, this time without the presence of the girlfriend, he attempted to appear nonchalant, sporting a university hoodie and jeans that were shouting him chill. But Pereira caught sight of his hands. Agitated, restive, plucking at a loose thread on his sleeve. "Ask me anything," he said agreeably. "How long did you know Brett?" She started off lightly. "Didn't," he replied. "Hardly knew who he was. The freshmen weren't on my radar, really." Pereira nodded, scribbling irrelevant notes on her pad. And then, out of nowhere, she changed subjects. "Initiation night. Tell me about it." His jaw clenched. "Same as last time, we discussed it." "Yeah, but nothing came of it." She sat back, let the tension simmer, and then gave him a whammy. "We pulled the dorm phone records," she told him quietly. The call to Brett's room was made on a payphone outside the student union at 8:47 p.m. The same payphone you typically study at. Bauer's facade broke immediately. He stuttered, saying anyone could have made the call on that phone. But his face went pale, and Pereira saw it, the flicker of fear that no denial could conceal. She didn't press any further. Not yet. Fear, she knew, could accomplish more in a single night than all the interrogation. The other students entered one by one. A procession of nervous 19- and 20-year-olds with trembly testimonies that converged just enough to ring hollow. There was Kyle Renard, a forestry major who swore he'd been at the campus pub until closing. Melissa Dubois, a civil engineering student, who said she'd only heard rumors but knew nothing. And Jordan Schmidt, quiet and nervous, who admitted he'd been invited to join the initiation but refused because, as he put it, it was getting out of hand. That sentence made Pereira lean forward. "Out of hand?" she inquired softly. Schmidt paused. His gaze slid towards the door as if he was doing math to determine how quickly he could get out. At last, he grumbled that Travis and some others had been discussing making this year's initiation one to remember, something that would push the freshmen to their limits. Pereira's pen stopped moving. "What, exactly," she asked softly, "did that mean?" When police interrogated Jordan Schmidt, he said he didn't know anything else. He had tuned out when the older students began making plans. "I did not want any part of it," he said, staring at the table. And Pereira believed him, sort of. Because whatever did occur that evening, Schmidt did not want to recall it. 3 days after that, on October 21st, the case suddenly changed direction. That morning, Dr. Leonard Fisher, a veteran professor in the Forestry and Land Management Department, was interviewed by Sergeant Linda Pereira. He was 52, bespectacled with wire rims, and had a deeply etched face that suggested Head spent his life outdoors. Head taught at the university for almost 2 decades, respected, liked, famous for his outdoor field courses in the northern wilderness. Students characterized him as tough but fair, the sort of professor who made you work for your grades but would assist you if you requested his aid. Pereira had nothing to suspect about him, at least not until the background reports arrived. Fisher, as it turned out, was the faculty sponsor of the Engineering Students Field Trip Club, an organization co-advised by none other than Travis Bauer. It wasn't a strong connection, but in a town this small, the thinnest thread might be important. Fisher sat quietly opposite Pereira, hands steepled, body loose, like a man who knew he had nothing to conceal. He spoke with real concern for Brett's vanishing and said he never met the young man in person, but had heard good things about the incoming forestry students. When questioned regarding the so-called initiation customs, Fisher sighed. It's been an issue for years, he stated. The administration continues to try to suppress it, but these things tend to stick around. I don't agree with hazing. I believe it's unsafe and futile. His words were so precisely measured, too precise. Pereira observed the exactness in his voice, the practiced rhythm. She asked where Head been on the night of the 17th. At home, he said. 20 minutes outside of Drumheller. Writing a paper. Alone. No witnesses. No one to attest to his presence. Pereira wrote that down. And with the days that followed, something else started to eat at her. Not what people were saying, but what they weren't. There had been a silence surrounding Brett Morrison's vanishing that wasn't natural. A forced forgetting. Someone had placed that call. Someone had lured Brett out to the abandoned grain elevator. But in a community where news traveled faster than fire, no one knew anything. Pereira started to wonder if this wasn't a bad joke. Something more sinister, something being actively concealed. And the more pressure she applied, the tighter the town seemed to knit itself together. Within the first week, the news had hit the national wires. An American young woman disappearing in the countryside of Alberta. It had the makings of a banner headline. The foreign connection, the mystery, the terror. Local media printed Carol Morrison holding her son's graduation picture. Her eyes sunken from nights without sleep, pleading for anyone with information to contact them. The university made a delicately crafted statement stating deep concern and complete cooperation with the authorities. And still, nobody spoke. The wall of silence remained intact. Then, at last, came the break. It was on October 24th, a week since Brett had gone missing, that a rancher, Douglas Quinn, phoned the RCMP. He was an owner of a large farm some 12 kilometers east of the university and informed them Head discovered something unusual caught in his fence line. Quinn was 73, a third-generation rancher from the cattle side of the business with tough hands and an adult lifetime's wariness of strangers. He'd been inspecting a piece of fence where deer had broken through when he saw something blue caught up in the barbed wire. Initially, he took it to be trash, an off-white piece of cloth swept in from the road. But as he approached it, he saw it was a denim jacket worn, faded, frayed at cuffs, with a small tear closer to the shoulder seam. Constable Derek Santoro sped off in immediate response. His cruiser bounced along the ranch's rutted dirt road, the endless prairie rolling away in every direction. The countryside out there was even emptier than around the grain elevator. Desolate, wind-blown, still. The fence upon which the jacket was draped extended along the rim of a steep ravine, 15 feet down to a dry creek bottom lined with rocks and scrub. Santoro took pictures of the jacket before slowly unhooking it from the wire. It appeared as though a person had attempted to climb the fence hurriedly, or had been pulled across it. In the right pocket was a brown leather wallet, wet from morning dew. Santoro opened it using gloved hands, and his stomach dropped. Oregon driver's license, Brett Allen Morrison. Date of birth, March 14, 1985. The picture indicated that same timid smile Carol Morrison had been presenting to the press for days. Fortunate contents were inside, however, $43, a university ID card, a bank card, and an October 15th receipt from a Drumheller coffee shop, 2 days prior to Brett's disappearance. What wasn't there, however, was most important. No Canadian currency. No credit cards aside from the bank card. No other identification. Pereira had written it all down in her report. The wallet made this not a robbery. And the position of the jacket, 12 kilometers east of campus, created new questions. The ancient grain elevator had been 4 kilometers west. How had Brett's possessions traveled 16 kilometers in the opposite direction? The discovery rekindled the hunt. Groups of people went back to the site with dogs and climbing equipment, rappelling into the ravine, searching the dry creek bed and the caverns pocked along sides. Drumheller volunteers returned once more, searching the open fields under a gray, unforgiving sky. Carol and James Morrison were on the perimeter of the search area. Each bark from a dog or yell from someone made Carol's heart jump, to shatter when it proved to be nothing. James patrolled the fence line repeatedly, scanning barbed wire, attempting to put it all together. Why was Brett's jacket here, so far from where he disappeared? If he'd been on foot, there was no way. The ground between the two locations was rugged, uncharted, and dangerous at night. No first-year student could have made that trip by himself, unless he knew precisely where he was heading. Unless someone had brought him there. At RCMP headquarters, Pereira presented the facts to her staff, now augmented by Calgary major crimes detectives. There were just 3 options. 1. Brett had gone to the grain elevator as told. Something did not go right there and he ran away, perhaps confused, perhaps hurt, and somehow made his way near that ravine. 2. The elevator was a trap. The actual meeting place was somewhere in between. 3. Brett never walked. He was taken to the fence line against his will, and whatever occurred there. But each theory was flawed. There were no tire tracks along the fence. No indication of a car. No footprints leading off. Only the jacket. One quiet witness trapped in the wire, flapping in the wind like the ghost of the boy who had worn it. The more the RCMP looked, the more bizarre it got. The ground around the ravine was hard and dry, and not a single tire mark to be seen. No one had said they saw cars in the area that night. And maybe most disturbing of all, there was no sign of Brett Morrison. No footprints. No body. Nothing but that solitary denim jacket flying in the prairie breeze. The jacket was forwarded to the Edmonton RCMP Forensic Lab for testing. In 2003, forensic technology wasn't as sophisticated, slower, less accurate, but even then, the laboratory was able to pull useful clues. Under the microscope, the soil particles deep in the fibers were found to be embedded soil that didn't belong to the university grounds. Rather, it matched the clay-based soil near the ravine, proving that the jacket hadn't been carried there afterward. It had been there the whole time. Small pieces of plant, sagebrush, prairie grass were glued to the seams. And among them, something unusual, artificial blue fibers that didn't match the jacket. Fibers from a different piece of clothing, or possibly from another person altogether. But it was the stains that chilled Pereira when she read the laboratory reports. Little dark spots on the right arm. Blood. Too broken down to be typed immediately, but still good for DNA analysis. Weeks of waiting in 2003 meant that, as the lab functioned, a new clue emerged from an unexpected source. A university janitor named Maria Oliveira. Having watched Carol Morrison's emotionally charged appeal on TV, Maria stepped forward. She explained to police that on October 18th at about 5:30 a.m., she'd observed 2 young male students departing the Earth Sciences building. That was unusual. The building was meant to be secured after midnight. The 2 had been moving quickly toward the parking lot, looking nervous. She wasn't sure, but she believed she had seen one of them before, Travis Bauer. She'd seen him on campus previously, tall, athletic, one of those guys with that certain confidence he exuded as he walked. When Pereira presented to her a photo lineup, Oliveira hesitated, then indicated Bauer and a second student, Cole Murphy, a third-year engineering major and one of Bauer's best friends. Cole Murphy was recruited on the 27th of October. He wasn't Bauer, quieter, nearly bashful, with a boyish face that gave him an almost youthful appearance despite his years. His alibi was straightforward. He was home in Drumheller that evening, eating dinner with his parents and sleeping over. His mother vouched for it, although Pereira couldn't help but sense she'd rehearsed those responses earlier. When Pereira made the custodian's comment that had been spotted exiting the building where Earth Sciences was located early one morning, Murphy stood still. His face went pale. He protested, claimed Maria must have been mistaken. But his hands did not agree. They shook on the table. Pereira pushed further, asking why he could have been there later than anyone else. Murphy clammed up. He requested representation by a lawyer. The investigation was beginning to buckle under the pressure of contradictions. A jacket a dozen kilometers from where Brett had last been seen. Blood that could or could not have been his. Witnesses finding students where they shouldn't be. Rehearsed-sounding alibis. And in the midst of it all, Brett Morrison still hadn't been found, as if the prairie had devoured him whole. Weeks went by before the DNA results finally arrived. And they were devastating. The blood was human. Type-O-positive, the same as Brett, but also the type found in almost 40% of the population. Not enough to establish an absolute match. Too much time, too much use. The elements had denuded the evidence. It might have been his blood, or someone's. It was so little that it might have been from something insignificant. A scrape, a nosebleed. It showed nothing and told nothing. And for the Morrisons, not knowing was more terrible than knowing. By December 2003, winter had frozen the prairies in ice. Search operations were halted. Temperatures dropped below -20, and the unspoken reality came to be simply impossible to deny. If Brett was still alive out there, he couldn't have made it. The case remained open, but in name only. Investigators were transferred Pereira to other cases. Yet she left Brett's case folder on her desk, adding to it each time a fresh fragment was found. The additions became fewer, then ceased altogether. The university fell silent. Students graduated, left, and took their secrets with them. But one did not move on. Carol Morrison remained. She and her husband took a tiny apartment on Railway Avenue, a rickety old building with paper-thin walls and windows that shook when the prairie wind screamed through town. James ultimately had to go back to Portland. His employment couldn't be delayed indefinitely. But Carol would not leave. She created a website, Find Brett Morrison. Putting up his photo, his story, his smile. She printed hundreds of notices and took them out to every town within 100 kilometers. The wind destroyed them, but she simply printed more. She went back to the ravine where the jacket was discovered every few days. Plodding through ice and snow, shouting her son's name across the deserted prairie until her voice cracked. Locals observed her with uncomfortable sympathy. To them, she was the heartbroken American who couldn't realize what all the others silently assumed, that the prairie holds what it claims. In March 2004, Carol did hire a private investigator, Gerald Fraser, a retired Calgary RCMP officer. He was 61, fastidious, and costly. Fraser re-questioned everybody. He went back to the same names again: Bauer, Murphy, Fisher. He discovered discrepancies, odd coincidences, tales that didn't quite match, but nothing that he could prove. Bauer, who had moved on to British Columbia, upheld his original testimony. Murphy, also a graduate, would not speak without a lawyer. Fisher sympathized but had nothing new to say. 3 months and almost $20,000 later, Fraser delivered the news Carol dreaded. Head reached the same brick wall the RCMP had. Someone knew something, but no one was speaking. In 2006, the RCMP reclassified the case. Suspected accidental death. The official explanation was neat, nearly reassuring in its simplicity. Brett had visited the grain elevator for reasons unknown, possibly as part of initiation. He could have fallen, wandered off, or died of exposure. The position of his jacket indicated he had walked east, lost and hurt. And what about the missing body? The coulees, caves, and crumbling rock of the Badlands were waiting to swallow it up. It might have been buried, washed out, or buried under a landslide. It was a tidy solution, one that closed the case file with neat corners. But to Carol Morrison, it was just a tale constructed to help her survive the silence. Because she knew, in her heart of hearts, that the prairie hadn't claimed her son accidentally. Someone had. The encounter with the RCMP was to provide closure. It didn't. When James and Carol Morrison's son was informed by the officers that their son had probably wandered off into the Badlands and died from exposure, Carol got up, her colorless face, shaking voice, and said something everyone else was too scared to say. No, she said to them. My son wasn't lost. Someone abducted him. Someone murdered him. And the rest of you are covering for one another. It was the last time she ever called the RCMP without a shout of anger in her voice. In the years that followed, there was a slow kind of drowning in grief. Not the searing pain of tragedy, but the endless hurt of not knowing. James attempted to move on, to construct something like a future, but Carol couldn't. Their marriage fractured under the strain of silence. She held on to the only thing she had left, the search. The site Shed built, Find Brett Morrison. Com was shrine and fixation. True crime fans and anonymous strangers from around the internet wrote her theories. Some sound, some absurd, all starving her longing hope that someone, somewhere, still cared. Each October, she went back to Drumheller, the site where her world had begun. Small vigils were first held close to the grain elevator. Scores attended, candles flickering in the prairie breeze. Fewer and fewer people attended each year, though. By 2008, it was only Carol. Standing alone in the chill, her candle perpetually snuffed by the wind, talking to a son who never responded. The university, too, attempted to get on with things. New regulations were enacted, more stringent hazing regulations, new codes of student conduct, but they never once named Brett Morrison. A small bronze memorial plaque materialized in the Student Union building, in memory of Brett A. Morrison, 1985 to 2003. The dates bore a finality that no one had yet achieved. Carol attended the ceremony. She said nothing. Her silence spoke louder than any accusation could. Leonard Fisher retired in 2010. He departed with a good pension and the sort of courteous send-off reserved for distinguished faculty. He retired to Vancouver Island, to a small house overlooking the Pacific. In his last interview with the local Drumheller newspaper, he spoke words of condolence for the Morrison family, said he wished them peace, and that someday the mystery of what had happened to Brett would be solved. The photograph caught him smiling, eyes gentle, hands clasped. Nobody doubted him. Nobody ever did. By 2012, the case had disappeared entirely from public consciousness. A forgotten news headline, an anecdote about student initiation told to new freshmen without names and context. The site Carol had once updated daily remained, but it was no longer live, static, stuck in time like Brett himself. Shed returned to Portland, getting a small, unobtrusive job in a neighborhood library, attempting to rebuild something from the remains of her previous life. She never removed Brett's room, never put away his belongings. And on the nights when sleep would not come, Shed reminded herself, the truth is still out there. It's just waiting to be found. She had no way of knowing how correct she was, or how long it would take. 16 years later, a letter arrives. It was a Tuesday morning, March 2019, when the letter was received at the Drumheller RCMP detachment. A white envelope. Plain. No return address. Calgary postmark. Inside, a plain sheet of lined notebook paper. For sentences, typed neatly in block letters. I know where the American student is buried. He didn't die by accident. People covered it up. Check the old Fisher property. No signature. No phone number. No clue. The clerk who opened it, Sharon Greco, an 8-year civilian employee at the detachment, read it twice before she realized what she was holding. Her hands shook. Everyone who'd worked in Drumheller long enough knew Brett Morrison. His was the cold case, the one older officers referenced with a sigh when discussing the ones that got away. Sharon folded the paper and slipped it into a bag of evidence, even though her prints were already on it. She marched directly to the office of Detective Sergeant Emma Gallagher. Gallagher was 43, 10 years in major crimes, renowned for her patience and meticulousness. She'd come to the RCMP in 2009, 6 years since Brett disappeared, and had only heard the name in passing as one of those files that nagged the morgue. As she read the letter, she felt her pulse accelerate. This wasn't a clue, though. It was embers in a burning fire that had long since gone cold. Was it possible? Or another pitiless joke played on a bereaved mother 16 years too late? Gallagher didn't dawdle. She began by trying to determine what on earth the old Fisher property referred to. Leonard Fisher, who is 73 years old and retired in Nanaimo, British Columbia, had owned several properties throughout his time in Alberta. His primary residence in Drumheller was sold back in 2010. Nothing out of the ordinary there. However, when Gallagher searched through land registry records, something seemed amiss. Between 1998 and 2006, Fisher had owned a quarter section of countryside property, 160 acres of remote prairie 30 kilometers northeast of Drumheller. It was recorded on paper as recreational land, bought for personal use and future development. But no development had ever occurred. The property contained an old farmhouse, a falling-apart barn, and a few scattered outbuildings. Fisher had sold it in 2006 to a corporate ranching business, which utilized the surrounding pasture for cattle but left the structures alone. That was the old Fisher property. Gallagher drove out there herself. A gray March day, the sky low and heavy, the wind cutting across the open plain. The access road was barely a road at all, just muddy ruts carved through melting snow. The farmhouse stood at the edge of the property, half collapsed, windows broken, roof sagging. The barn leaned dangerously, one wall already caved in. It looked abandoned, forgotten, the kind of place you'd expect to find ghosts, not answers. She walked slowly through the knee-high grass, the cold biting through her coat. Why here? She asked herself. If a body had indeed been buried, why here near Fisher? It was out of the way, yes, but within sight of the road. And in 2003, when he owned the property and later sold it, people who knew he did might have seen strange goings-on. The question nagged at her. Was the letter a forgery? Or was this the tip the Morrison family had waited 16 years to receive? Before anything could be attempted, Gallagher required permission and funding. A comprehensive forensic dig wasn't inexpensive, particularly for a lead on 4 anonymous sentences. Somewhere in Ottawa, a cost-benefit analysis would soon determine if Brett Morrison's tale was worth revisiting. And in that instant, shivering in the icy wind alongside the shattered wreckage of a barn, Detective Sergeant Emma Gallagher made a vow of silence. If Brett Morrison had even the slightest possibility of being here, she was going to track him down. Initially, the RCMP brass wasn't so sure. It was 16 years ago, and an anonymous letter with no fingerprints, no signature, and no discernible motive didn't seem like much to work with. But Detective Sergeant Emma Gallagher didn't see it that way. The language of the letter, its specificity, was important. The author hadn't simply indicated a place. They'd specified it. The old Fisher property. That kind of language implied inside information, the sort of specificity only someone familiar with the initial events would possess. And then, of course, there was timing. 16 years. Enough time for guilt to stew. Enough time for one's conscience to insist on being heard at last. Following some nervous weeks of intragovernmental deliberation, sanction was obtained in May 2019. Gallagher would have a full search team, including forensic anthropologists from the RCMP Forensic Anthropology Unit and a ground-penetrating radar team. The technology had advanced much since 2003. The new radar could scan the Earth like an X-ray, picking up even the smallest changes in soil density, the unmistakable signs of digging, of something hidden and abandoned. They started methodically, grid by grid, meter by meter, searching the empty ground around the old farmhouse and barn, anywhere the dirt might have been turned. Meanwhile, Gallagher made a call she both dreaded and felt obligated to make. It had been years since anyone from the RCMP had spoken to Carol Morrison. Gallagher wanted her to hear it directly. A search was underway. No promises, no guarantees, but it was something. Carol's response was immediate. Fierce. I always knew, she told Gallagher. Someone buried my son, and I'm getting on the next plane. On the third day of searching, the radar beeped. A 6x3 rectangle of ground, just outside the barn's fallen wall, glowed on the screen. a thick, irregular mass 6 feet deep. The technicians traded hushed glances. Everyone knew what that probably indicated. Gallagher sensed the air thicken, that live, awful quiet that always preceded discovery. Digging started the following morning. Slowly, carefully, the crew employed tiny hand tools and brushes, working with the finesse of archaeologists. Every inch was shot, noted, entered. The ground was obstinate, clay-rich, cold, uncooperative, as if it didn't want to relinquish what it contained. By day 5, Carol Morrison was on site. A victim services coordinator took her straight from the Calgary airport to the site. She hovered behind the yellow tape, frozen, observing the team in action. Her face was void of hope, of despair, only a look of vindication, of something Shed always known finally fighting its way to the surface. James Morrison didn't arrive. The couple had been divorced in 2014. Had remarried, begun anew in Seattle. When Carol phoned him about the search, had spoken softly, "I can't face it." She did not blame him. Obsession had come close to killing her in 16 years. He had merely opted for survival rather than memory. And then, on May 19, 2019, as the sun set low and prairie wind grew sharp and golden, the dig team struck something hard. Bones. Incomplete but decidedly human. Encased in frayed shreds of what had likely been a blanket or tarp. The chief forensic anthropologist, Dr. Patricia Sullivan, knelt next to the pit and examined the bones. Her tone, when she spoke, was subdued but weighted. This was intentional. And it's been here a long time. DNA verification arrived on June 3, 2019, drawn from a molar tooth that had endured 16 brutal Canadian winters. The results were run through computers with modern databases that hadn't even been born yet in 2003. When the match was received, there was no question. The remains were Brett Allen Morrison. 16 years of speculation, theories, and false hope had finally been found. Sullivan's initial report indicated hypothermia complicated by blunt trauma to the rear of the skull. The wound wasn't fatal by itself, but would have left Brett dazed, confused, and susceptible to the October chill. What the bones could not tell was motive. Had he stumbled, been hit, or been left to die on purpose? There were no defensive wounds, no broken arms or fingers that would indicate a struggle, but after 16 years in the ground, evidence such as that could have just vanished. For Gallagher, the find transformed everything. This was no longer a missing persons investigation. This was a criminal probe, at the very least criminal negligence in causing death, and probably indignity to human remains. Gallagher could feel it, the heavy burden of injustice bearing down across the years. Shed worked homicide for years, but this one cut differently. There was a cold, calculated viciousness in the hiding, a silent, thoughtful evil that didn't decay with years. And everything led in one direction, Dr. Leonard Fisher. But Fisher was 73 years old, retired, and living quietly on Vancouver Island. To make a case that would hold up in court, Gallagher required more than proximity and coincidence. She required proof, evidence of motive, opportunity, and connection. That involved starting over. Going back to 2003, to a university that had spent 16 years trying to pretend this never occurred. Memories are fleeting. Witnesses relocate. Files go missing. But Gallagher possessed something the initial investigators did not. Contemporary digital forensics, the power to search into servers, records, and emails that everyone assumed had been lost. When she asked to access the university's archived email servers of 2003, the administration stalled. Legal counsel held back, citing privacy regulations and reputation issues. They wanted this back in the ground, literally and metaphorically. But Gallagher was not going to give up. A court order brought compliance. By July 2019, an RCMP technical unit started digging through dusty backup tapes and outdated file formats. Information nobody had handled in more than a decade. Piece by piece, they reassembled old strings of email, remains of erased messages, and internal messages that had lived by chance. It was digital archaeology working with ghosts from code. And what they discovered was incriminating. Not vague, not speculative, specific. Names, dates, Messages that bound people together in ways nobody had ever acknowledged. The truth Carol Morrison had waited 16 years to find was finally beginning to emerge, one recovered email at a time. Also, sometimes the truth doesn't disappear. It simply lurks in plain sight, waiting for the right set of eyes to see in the right spot. In July 2019, those eyes were Detective Sergeant Emma Gallagher's. Within the shadowy light of an RCMP digital forensics unit, she gazed at a recovered email thread, 4 names that had mysteriously endured 16 years of digital rot. Travis Bauer, Cole Murphy, Ryan Boyle, and Dr. Leonard Fisher. 4 accounts, 1 discussion, and hidden within their stilted academic verbiage was something sinister. The emails were dated early October 2003, 2 weeks before Brett Morrison disappeared. On the surface, they were innocuous conversations about freshman orientation events. But Gallagher's radar twitched as she read between lines. Bauer had written, "Let's make this year one they'll never forget. We need to identify the weak ones early." That wording, the weak ones, wasn't student bonding. It was a test, a selection. Fisher's official response seemed guarded, verging on bureaucratic. "Remember, all activities must be in accordance with university policy. Student safety is always the priority." But then, there was another message, a secondary secret one, sent right from Leonard Fisher at university, CA to Travis Bauer. It read simply, "Use the old site we talked about. Nobody ever goes there. Just get all the cleanup done after." That message had been erased, wiped from all mailboxes within weeks of Brett's vanishing. But the university's old backup system had inadvertently saved it. A ghost file, a voice from the past. And it wasn't the only one. There were others as well, bits of frantic messages from the end of October 2003. Cole Murphy to Bauer. "Must talk in person. Not safe to do this." Bauer to Fisher. "Complication has arisen. Need your opinion now." And Fisher's return, curt and menacing. "My office. 6 a.m. tomorrow. Tell no one." All the messages were dated within days of Brett's vanishing. This was no coincidence. This was damage control. Gallagher had one more trick up his sleeve. He brought in Adrian Costa, an RCMP digital forensic expert with the Technological Crimes Unit, an individual who handled data like a crime scene. Costa plunged deep into the metadata, the unseen fingerprints embedded in each email, each login. And what he discovered created a ripple effect throughout the entire investigation. Fisher's university account was accessed on the evening of October 17, 2003, from his office computer. At 11:47 p.m., hours passed when the building ought to have closed. Hours passed when Brett Morrison was ever seen leaving his dorm. The system logs indicated Fisher remained logged on until 2 a.m., a practice totally uncharacteristic of a professor who had early office hours. Even more incriminating, Fisher's personal computer, listed in his home address, had logged into the university's internal network several times over the weeks that followed. Remote connections. Late night. He no longer taught. He cleaned. Costas' review became digital archaeology. He discovered erased calendar entries labeled field work for the night of October 17th, a night for which there existed no corresponding field trip, no departmental documentation, no witnesses. He discovered deleted files on Fisher's office computer, erased forever, cleaned using high-level software tools most scholars wouldn't even be aware of. The purge started on the 19th of October, 2 days after Brett disappeared, and went on for weeks. This was not sloppy erasure. This was a cover-up. Gallagher sat in the light of the forensic screens, reconstructing pieces of a 16-year-old conspiracy. The emails confirmed Fisher's participation in plotting activities that had clearly derailed. The midnight logins put him on campus at the wrong time. And the deliberate erasing revealed one thing more than anything else. He knew precisely what had occurred. But she still didn't have one essential piece. A live voice. Someone who'd been there. Someone willing to break. And she already had an idea who that was. Cole Murphy, 37 years old. Married. 2 children. a well-respected civil engineer working behind the scenes in Edmonton's suburbs. His social media profile presented the image of a success story volunteer, soccer coach, family man, project manager. But to Gallagher, that smile in his picture looked rehearsed. She'd seen it before, the type of smile that belonged to a person who's had to spend decades locking the monster behind their ribcage. On the afternoon of an August day in 2019, Gallagher entered the glass and steel lobby of Murphy's engineering company. She identified herself, badge held out. And in that initial moment, before he could even discipline his face, she saw it all: recognition, fear, and something more. Relief. Murphy requested to speak alone. They strolled to a small park across the street, where families gathered and children's laughter hung on the summer breeze. He sat down on a bench, buried his face in his hands, and when he finally spoke, his voice trembled. "I knew this day would come," he said. "I've known for 16 years. Gallagher stayed silent. Let the weight of those words settle. When he lifted his head again, his eyes were red. "I didn't kill him," he whispered, "but I was there, and I helped cover it up. And I've lived with that every single day since." He spoke for 2 hours, pausing frequently, trembling, wiping away tears with the heel of his hand like a man falling back into the scared little boy he once was. He had been 20 years old that fall, an engineering major in his 3rd year. The initiation ceremonies had sounded like a harmless ritual initially. Something exciting, clandestine, a rite of passage conducted by senior classmen. Travis Bauer had sold it as proving you're part of the family. And Dr. Leonard Fisher, the silver-haired, venerable professor who everyone revered, had subtly promoted it, referring to it as character building. Murphy's voice broke when he spoke the words. He hung his head, ashamed. And Gallagher knew, at last, they were breaching 16 years of silence. Murphy's confession started quietly, but what he said next would change everything. He claimed that it had all begun with what Dr. Fisher referred to as a way to test character, an unofficial initiation. The notion, in Fisher's words, was to determine which first-year students possessed the mental resilience necessary for the grueling fieldwork that lay ahead. And Fisher himself had selected the site, the crumbling old grain elevator, a lone structure on the prairie. Head described it as offering the right atmosphere of isolation and challenge. The plan, as Murphy comprehended it, sounded nearly innocuous: call in individual freshmen one at a time, present them with challenges designed to gauge their determination. It was meant to be psychological, not physical. A game. A test of bravery. But as so many things that start out as games, it went horribly awry. They'd selected Brett Morrison because he stood out, the lone American in the program for that year. To the others, that made him the ideal target. Alone, wanting to fit in, and less likely to whine. Murphy's voice broke when he confessed to that. The viciousness of it hit him for the first time in 16 years. Around 8:30 p.m., a member of the group, Ryan Boyle, phoned Brett's dorm room. They instructed him to go to the grain elevator by himself. They said it was a test. That if he passed, he'd be respected and accepted by the upperclassmen. And Brett believed them. Then he explained their options. They could tell the truth, get criminal charges brought against them, and ruin their lives, or they could stage it as a terrible accident and bury the truth once and for all. He instructed them precisely where to go, and they complied. When Gallagher demanded to know why they'd complied, why they hadn't reported to the police, why they'd let Brett's mother mourn for 16 years, Murphy simply shook his head. It was too late, he breathed. By the time we figured out how bad, we were already in it. Then Gallagher brought up the question that counted most. Who else was there? Murphy paused, then provided her with names. Ryan Boyle, who'd called and assisted in getting Brett moved. Tyler Gordon, who dealt with the physical aspects of the initiation. Marcus Hamilton, a 4th year who'd been driving one of the cars. And Travis Bauer, the one who'd made it all happen. For students, 1 professor, 5 individuals who'd quietly buried a boy, and the truth for 16 years. Murphy told him Head sent the anonymous letter because he couldn't live with it anymore. He thought about his 7-year-old daughter and envisioned her at 18, trusting others who could betray her trust, and something inside him broke. He mailed the letter. Then he waited for somebody to discover it, afraid to approach it himself. Now, opposite Gallagher, his tears streaming down his face, he claimed to be finished running. Living with the secret, he said, has been its own kind of death. Murphy's admission provided Gallagher with what she was seeking, leverage. But leverage was not enough to stand up in court. She required corroboration, physical evidence, and additional voices. Murphy's account was teary but unsightly, details omitted, timelines fuzzy, names partially withheld. Any good defense lawyer could rip it to shreds. Gallagher required the others. And she required them before news spread that Cole Murphy had spoken. The first to fall was Ryan Boyle. On the 29th of August 2019, RCMP officers showed up at his residence in Fort McMurray before sunrise. Boyle's wife was in the doorway, their 3 kids hiding behind her as officers took him away in handcuffs and read him his rights. He didn't struggle, didn't say a word. His face was a mask, as if he'd been expecting this knock on his door all his life. During interrogation, Boyle remained quiet to begin with, referring his lawyer after each question. But his lawyer, a grizzled defense expert, did the math. 5 suspects, one of whom had confessed. The first to talk would receive leniency. The last would go down. 6 hours pass and Boyle cracks. His account aligned with Murphy's. Most of it. But there were discrepancies. Boyle did confess to placing the telephone call to Brett's residence hall. Confirmed being at the grain elevator. Confirmed assisting the move of Brett to the access road. But when it came to what took place next, the tone changed. Murphy had portrayed Fisher as the mastermind, calm, strong-willed, the one issuing commands. Boyle's account? The opposite. He claimed they'd panicked. They'd called Fisher not because he commanded them, but because they needed someone, an adult, an authority to hide behind. He said Fisher had taken a look at Brett in the barn, his pulse, his pupils, before instructing them on precisely what to do next. Boyle explained that Dr. Fisher had checked Brett out that evening, monitored his pulse, peered at his pupils, and concluded the injury wasn't serious enough to take him to the hospital. Fisher explained to them that actual danger was not the wound on the head, but hypothermia. Warmth and bed rest, he assured them, would suffice. And they accepted it. They accepted it because Fisher was Dr. Leonard Fisher, authoritative, experienced, the voice of reason. So when Brett died, they rationalized that it was a tragic accident, not murder. But as Boyle talked, Gallagher could hear the self-rationalization in each word, that frantically needed belief they'd been deceived, rather than being in on it. She didn't cut him off. She simply took down everything, the truth hanging there, heavy and irrefutable. Tracking down Tyler Gordon was more difficult. Head departed Canada in 2007, employed in Western Australia's mining industry. Extraditing him legally, for a case dating 16 years earlier, would be complex. But then, something strange occurred. Gordon returned voluntarily. In September 2019, he arrived at Calgary International Airport, 2 suitcases, an Australian wife on his arm, and the face of a man shattered by the weight of his own history. His lawyer had already wrangled his cooperation before the plane even landed. And when Gordon testified, his version was the most detailed, the most gut-wrenching. Had taken notes. A journal, secreted for 16 years in a box in his parents' basement. Pages on which everything, the preparation, the act, the cover-up, had been recorded with a tone so coolly analytical that it was startling. From those pages, Fisher hadn't lost his cool when he got there that evening. Head remained relaxed, almost charged. It was as though the crisis had focused him. Fisher stepped in right away, delegating tasks, issuing commands, acting with focus, as if Head planned all along for this contingency. He was the one who insisted that the body must be concealed. He was the one who selected the site, his own land. And he was the one who oversaw the excavation before sunrise on the 18th of October 2003. They'd taken shovels from the university maintenance shop. Students took turns digging, and Fisher observed. When sunrise arrived, Brett Morrison was gone. 6 feet of clay earth covering him, 16 years of silence. One of the 5, Marcus Hamilton, would never talk. Had been killed in 2011, in a road accident near Red Deer. Drunk, by himself, driving too quickly. But when Gallagher called his parents, their agony opened like a wound. They told him Marcus had fought for years, addiction, depression, nightmares. They'd never understood why. Now they did. Another life lost on that October night. Another conscience buried in guilt. Then, at last, came October 12, 2019, precisely 16 years to the day since Brett vanished. Leonard Fisher was taken into custody at his Nanaimo, British Columbia home. The professor who'd once been well known was now a weak and frail 73-year-old, leading a quiet life in an ocean-facing bungalow. Fisher did not fight when the officers arrived. Did not even seem surprised. His attorney, Sarah Lemoyne, a celebrity defense lawyer, had already been hired, as if waiting for this to happen. The allegations were serious. Criminal negligence resulting in death, accessory after the fact to manslaughter, indignity to human remains, obstruction of justice. In the bail hearing, prosecutors suggested Fisher might flee, but a judge approved conditional bail. No passport, weekly meetings, no contact with witnesses. The same day, RCMP had Travis Bauer under arrest in Kelowna, British Columbia. The man who'd once boasted about making this year unforgettable had established a thriving life. A forestry consultant, husband, father of 4. A pillar of his community. And in one day it all unraveled. Headlines in the local press read, "Respected Kelowna professional charged in 16-year-old death of student." The news shocked. Bauer's wife divorced him within weeks. He was fired by his employer on the spot. In court, his defense plan was revealed. He accused Fisher. He said he'd been a naive 21-year-old who'd been taken in by a charismatic professor. Follower, not a leader. But Gallagher and the Crown had his emails, the ones where he'd written "make this year unforgettable," and the ones where Fisher had instructed him to clean up after. There was no naivety in that. Only decision. The case against Fisher was powerful, but still circumstantial. After 16 years, the forensic testing could only speak so much. Brett's body displayed evidence of both hypothermia and blunt trauma. But whether or not he might have been saved with medical attention, that remained unknown. So the prosecution rested its case on something else. Intent. Crown prosecutors charged Fisher with having made a calculated, purposeful choice, not to kill but to allow to die. He'd opted for silence rather than accountability. Deception rather than compassion. And in the process, he walked the line between negligence and criminality. By hiding Brett's body and telling the others to remain silent, Fisher had committed an indignity to human remains and had hindered justice. But to make it stick, the Crown would have to persuade a jury to believe the very individuals who'd assisted in covering it up. Men with plea bargains, men willing to reduce their own culpability. It wouldn't be simple. That's where Margaret Fitzgerald stepped in. A seasoned Crown prosecutor who had a reputation for transforming shattered cases into watertight ones. She spent months analyzing each utterance, each timeline, each file and photo recovered. She practiced every witness statement until it was infallible. She interviewed Carol Morrison repeatedly to get her ready for what lay ahead. Fitzgerald alerted her. The defense would challenge the integrity of the witnesses. They'd label Brett's death a tragic accident. They'd portray Fisher as an old man unfairly blamed by guilty ex-students. Carol sat in silence. Then she made a statement Fitzgerald never forgot. "I don't care how long they serve. I just want the truth said out loud." Took 16 years, but the case went to trial at last. March 8, 2021, Drumheller Courthouse. The tiny Alberta community had never experienced anything like it. Journalists filled the courtroom. Satellite trucks jammed the streets. The world was paying attention at last. Why? Because this wasn't merely another cold case. It was about trust. About what occurs when power, fear, and silence shred a young man's life. And because in the gallery was Carol Morrison, the mother who never gave up looking. Day after day, she sat in the front row. Silent. Consistent. Her hands folded over a photo of her son. The trial opened, and the truth started to unravel. Cole Murphy testified first. His words shook. Several times, he cried. He spoke to the jury of the phone call to Brett's dorm room, of waiting at the grain elevator, of driving into the night. He confessed it all, his part, his culpability, his terror. He told her he hadn't really slept in 16 years. That each time he gazed at his children, he saw Brett. And that finally revealing the truth was both the most difficult thing he'd ever done, and the first time in his life he felt free. Brought under cross-examination by defense attorney Sarah Lemoyne, it was go for the jugular. She attempted to take Cole Murphy's credibility apart brick by brick, alleging his confession was not about truth, but survival. That after 16 years, his recollection had faded, that he'd constructed an easy narrative to deflect blame from himself and place it all on Dr. Fisher. Murphy didn't blink. Tears flowed openly on his face as Lemoyne asked, "Are you positive as can be that Dr. Fisher instructed you not to call for assistance?" Murphy met her eyes and said, "Yes, because I've heard those exact words every single day since." The room went silent. Then came Ryan Boyle. His account echoed Murphy's but added chilling detail. He described Fisher that night. Calm, methodical, detached. He'd probed Brett like it was an exercise in class. Checked his pulse, peered into his eyes, and pronounced the injury minor. Fisher informed them that hospitals were paranoid, emergency rooms were overcrowded, and it would just cause problems to take him there. They trusted him. At the moment, that calm was comforting. In retrospect, it seemed grotesque. When Lemoyne pinned Boyle on cross, inquiring whether Head really believed Fisher or merely wished to believe him, Boyle cracked. He confessed. He'd been afraid of losing everything. And that Head trusted authority rather than instinct. That moment of harsh candor, of confessing cowardice, heightened his testimony. But the devastating blow came from Tyler Gordon. For Gordon possessed something no one else did: written documentation. The diary Head concealed for 16 years was the prosecution's worst nightmare. Words were read out in court, sentences that chilled the room. F said, "We've got two options: hospital means police investigations, criminal records, shattered lives. Or we take care of it ourselves and nobody ever finds out." He made it sound sane. Like a cost-benefit calculation. We chose ourselves over Brett. I don't know how to live with that. Those sentences reverberated in the courtroom as a grave confession. The writing persisted, detailing Gordon's anguish as Carol Morrison looked for her son as he remained silent. By 2005, the journaling ceased. Gordon explained he could no longer watch his guilt in writing. But he had retained the journal, not because he feared, but because of punishment. Then it was Fisher's time to speak. His whole case was based on the one concept. It was a medical error, not a criminal act. Fisher asserted Head truly felt Brett's injury was slight, that Head never noticed any sign of peril, that even professional physicians could have overlooked it. Witnesses supported him, corroborating that hypothermia can conceal symptoms, that victims tend to be stable before they die. Lemoyne contended that yes, burying the body was ethically atrocious, but it was not murder. That Fisher had panicked, made a fatal error, but not intended to kill. She turned to the jury and asked, "Does destroying the life of a 73-year-old man truly serve justice, or simply vengeance?" For a moment, the courtroom was sharply divided. Then, against his attorney's advice, Dr. Fisher testified. He was gaunt, thin, pale, hands trembling as he took the oath. His voice was low but distinct. He acknowledged Head buried Brett, acknowledged Head deceived, and made Carol Morrison endure 16 years. But he maintained he hadn't realized Brett would kill himself. He said Head gone to check on him at around 4 a.m. That by that time Brett was dead. He asserted Head had to make an impossible decision. Destroy 5 young lives, or let the truth stay buried. And Head made the wrong choice. He told the court the guilt consumed him every day since. But when prosecutor Margaret Fitzgerald took the stand for cross-examination, it all came apart. She brought in emails, written prior to the initiation, in which Fisher had proposed the same out-of-the-way spot just in case. It suggested premeditation. It suggested Head thought something would go wrong. And then Fitzgerald posed the question that cut through the facade. If you really thought Brett would be okay, why did you order everyone to be quiet? Why did you ensure that no one called for help before he died? Fisher didn't respond. His poise cracked. His words stumbled. And when he descended from the witness stand, he was no longer the misguided mentor. He was a man who had put self-preservation over humanity. The jury deliberated for 4 days. For long, quiet days that contained 16 years of truth, falsehoods, shame, and sorrow. When they came back on April 19, 2021, the courtroom was full to overflowing. Aisles were filled with people. Carol Morrison held a victim services worker's hand so hard her knuckles were white. The clerk read out the verdicts individually. Guilty of criminal negligence resulting in death. Guilty of accessory after the fact. Guilty of indignity to human remains. Guilty of obstruction of justice. Not guilty of manslaughter, the sole charge that demanded proof of intent. It had been a divided verdict, but a weighty one. Fisher closed his eyes. Carol Morrison cried. 3 weeks later came the day of sentencing. 22 years in prison. At 73, it amounted to a sentence of life. Travis Bauer, who had been tried separately, was also found guilty, sentenced to 18 years. The judge deemed Fisher's conduct to be a betrayal of trust at the deepest level. The community of Drumheller was forever changed. Some declared justice had finally been served, that the mark of silence was at last washed away. Others declared the penalty to be excessive, Fisher being made a scapegoat for a teenager's terrible mistake. The university gave formal apologies to the Morrison family. They revised their student safety initiatives, prohibited hazing outright, and erected a bronze memorial to Brett Morrison's name. A photo, his dates, and the words, "Beloved son." Found at last. Each incoming class since 2021 has been addressed by Carol Morrison. She explains to them what silence costs. At Fisher's sentencing, Carol stood at the podium. 70 years old, her hair white, her voice unbroken. She spoke for 15 minutes. She told the court of the vigils, the sight, the cold nights spent sitting by the phone. Of the marriage that had cracked under sorrow. And of how the worst part was not losing her son, but being deprived of the truth. She fixed Fisher with a look and said, "You made me think he could still be alive. You took from me the right to weep for my child. I don't forgive you, but now, I can at last lay him to rest." When she was done, the courtroom fell silent. Even Fisher was in tears, although no one knew if it was regret or self-pity. On June 12, 2021, Brett Allen Morrison was finally laid to rest in Portland, Oregon, the city of his birth. His father, James, was there with his new family. His former roommate, Owen McLeod, the same man who'd reported him missing 18 years before, came in from Toronto. Hundreds attended the funeral. Some had never met Brett, but read his story and had to be there, to see, to mourn, to pay respects. Carol gave the eulogy. She talked of losing her son twice, once to death, and once to the inhumanity of hiding. And she talked about hope that perhaps finally Brett had found peace now. The headstone was plain. Simply his name, his years, and 5 words that told everything: beloved son. Found at last.